Herzlich willkommen zurück aus der Mittagspause. Mein Name ist Adél Holdampf-Wendel. Ich bin Bereichsleiterin für Arbeitsrecht und Arbeit 4.0 beim Digitalverband Bitkom. Es freut mich sehr, Sie in den nächsten knapp 2 Stunden durch das Programm der Innovation Stage führen zu dürfen. Heute Nachmittag geht es hier unter anderem um die Themen hybrides Arbeiten und auch um Digital Leadership. Ich lade Sie herzlich dazu ein, Ihre Fragen und Kommentare im Chat zu posten. Diskutieren Sie gerne auch in den sozialen Medien mit. Unser Hashtag lautet dazu WorkCulture22. Nun beginnen wir das Fachprogramm auf diesem Panel mit einem englischsprachigen, auf dieser Bühne mit einem englischsprachigen Panel zum Thema Regulierung der Plattformarbeit. Unter Plattformarbeit versteht man über digitale Plattformen vermittelte, bezahlte Dienstleistungsarbeit. Diese kann ortsunabhängig online, aber auch ortsgebunden in der analogen Welt stattfinden, in der physischen Welt geleistet werden. Dateneingabe, Übersetzungsarbeiten oder Programmieren sind Beispiele für die erste Gruppe, die sogenannte Cloud Work. Haushaltsnahe Dienstleistungen, Fahrdienste oder auch Lieferdienste sind Beispiele für die zweite Gruppe, die sogenannte Gig Work. Warum eine Regulierung auf der Ebene der Europäischen Union angestrebt wird und wie das aussehen soll, diskutiere ich mit unseren Panelisten. And now I switch to English to welcome our guests in this special panel. Bonjour à Bruxelles and a warm welcome to Tommaso Alberini. He is Policy Officer for Future of Work and the Director General for Employment and Social Affairs in the European Commission. Welcome. Also with us, Lukas Pilgram. He is Senior Specialist Global Public Policy and Government Affairs at Delivery Hero. Also welcome to you. And last but not least, I also welcome Markus Steinhauser. He is COO at Testbirds. Platform work is a rapidly growing segment of the economy. It is estimated that 28 million people in the EU work through digital platforms. For the vast majority of them, platform work is an additional source of income. Following 2 consultations with European social partners, the European Commission has published a package of measures concerning platform work at the end of 2021. Our discussion today will focus on the proposal for a directive on improving working conditions in platform work. I start with you, Mr. Alberini. Could you please briefly tell us why the Commission wishes to regulate platform work and what are the main propositions in the directive?
Thank you very much and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting discussion. Indeed, platform work, as you mentioned in your introduction, I mean, I don't speak German, but I understood some of the things that you were saying, and platform work is growing rapidly. It's increasingly a very kind of important element of our labor markets in Europe, of the EU's economy. I mean, it's grown more than 500% in the last few years, and our projections indicate that it will be growing even faster in the years to come. So by 2025, we are expected to have 43 million people in the European Union doing platform work. With such a rapid growth come challenges, of course, because being it a new way of organizing work, a new way of delivering on consumer demands and offering services, this kind of model challenges existing labor market institutions, existing regulations and existing ways of organizing work. For this reason, the Commission decided to act and to tackle the main challenges that it saw arising around the issue of platform work. And so after careful analysis and consultation of stakeholders, you mentioned the social partners, that of course we we consulted through a two-stage consultation, but also we had several roundtables and discussions and technical exchanges with platforms themselves, with people working through platforms, with other stakeholders, and we got to the conclusion that there were three main challenges that the Commission wanted to tackle. The first challenge is that of the employment status. Namely the fact that many people working through platforms often do not have clarity on what is the legal employment status that applies to them, and therefore all the regulations and rights that derive from that employment status, being it regulations on working time, on occupational safety and health, on the right to transparency, the right to information and consultation through trade unions, the right to minimum wages, etc. So by clarifying the employment status, you also clarify all the rights that apply to people working through platforms. Why is it so important, this challenge? Because we saw that around 90% of people working through platforms are classified as self-employed, and yet around 20% of people might be misclassified. So they might be classified as self-employed when in fact they actually are workers. So this is a quite important degree of misclassification in the labor market. The second challenge relates to algorithmic management, which of course is a novel thing. So this is the organization of work, the matching of labor demand and supply in the labor market through automated means. This is very new, and of course it raises challenges because often you don't know who is taking the decisions, who is accountable for certain decisions on the labor market, which have repercussions, of course, for the people who are subject to this algorithmic management, who should be consulted or informed about the changes that, for instance, the platforms put forward on the way in which their automated systems manage people. All these things are not regulated, and this leaves a bit the people who are subject to the algorithmic management in a kind of void, where they don't know what are their rights when their employer is in fact an algorithm. And the third challenge is that related to the lack of clarity of which obligations apply to platforms in terms of reporting, in terms of transmitting information to authorities. Where are they supposed to register as employers, as companies? Which kind of jurisdiction applies when it comes to disputes, for instance, and the work is performed in one member state, but the platform is registered in another. All these kind of cross-border issues were unclear. And so this was the kind of third challenge that we sought to address. And the directive, in fact, the proposal for a directive that was adopted in December goes along these lines. And the three main components are indeed, on the one hand, the rebuttable presumption of employment relationship that tackles the employment status challenge. And then there's the chapter on algorithmic management that creates new rights vis-a-vis algorithmic management. And then there's a third chapter that deals with transparency and traceability and the clarity on cross-border jurisdictional disputes and issues.
Thank you very much for this excellent summary of the directive and for the motivation of the Commission to propose the measures. I turn to you now, to Mr. Steinhauser and Mr. Pilgram. Can you briefly explain what your platform stands for, and how do you assess the potential impact of the regulation on your business model in general? We, of course, elaborate on details in the further discussion. Who would like to start?
Lukas. Yeah, so also thank you for the invite today. It's really good to be here, and I also think it's an important topic to talk about. So maybe real briefly what Testbirds stands for, what our mission is. We were talking about it a moment ago a little bit. Basically, we're trying to create a better digital world together with our clients and our testing community. And we're a platform in the sense that we have around about 600,000 people that are registered on our platform worldwide and who are testing apps and websites and other kinds of digital products for our clients. They get paid for that by us, and we are kind of, as a platform, aggregating and managing that whole process and providing the information back to our customers so they can improve their digital products. So as also Tommaso was talking about a moment ago, it's a very distributed model in the sense that our clients are coming from Germany, but other countries in Europe and also other parts of the world. And the same thing applies to the testing community or the people who are signed up on our platform. And I think it's a really important step to create more clarification, especially in Europe. So cross-country regarding employment status and also some of the other topics that Tommaso just mentioned, because there is a lot of unclarity, both for the people working for platforms or on platforms, but also for the platforms themselves, right? And I think the more clarity we can create moving forward in the next couple of years, the better kind of we will be able to create an ecosystem that also allows for both innovation, but also fair work, for example, for the platform workers. The directive itself, and I think we're going to talk about that a bit more in the next half hour, I think addresses some important points and topics. We as a platform originating in Germany, we're a bit concerned by some of the points in there and how broad they are, because I think talking about platforms as one kind of ecosystem is very challenging, because there are so many different types of platforms and models out there. So it's actually really hard to come up with something that fits all and still kind of go deep enough in order to make a difference maybe for the platforms or the people working on the platform. So I think that's one of the main challenges. We come back to that in the discussion and how we can maybe tackle that moving forward.
Thank you. Mr. Pilgram, how would you like to complete this?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, also from my side, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion, which is obviously a super important topic for us, for everybody. And I think also Tommaso gave already a great overview of the proposal itself. So I think we have a good basis for discussion, basically. So let me try to answer your questions, at least briefly now. So Delivery Hero is one of the world's leading local delivery platforms with around 50 markets worldwide. And that includes, of course, also the EU and Europe overall. And when I say local delivery platform, that means that we provide the opportunity for customers to order basically anything they want from restaurants and local shops that are on our apps. And in most cases, we organize then the delivery of the product to the customer. So the business model itself is always very, very similar throughout our markets. But the way that we work with couriers that ultimately take care of the delivery, so couriers, or how we say riders, really differs from country to country. The majority are self-employed couriers, riders, but we do in fact also work with employed riders in a number of markets. So in practice, this means we have simply self-employed riders and employed riders in one market, for instance, that work hand in hand, basically. So they work in parallel. So while this always varies from country to country, most riders, the vast majority, still have in common that they do this work primarily, as you also said in the beginning, as a complementary activity, or at least a temporary activity. That could be because they're students or because they have another job, but it's not the typical full-time job, I think that, for instance, we all on this panel have. And when we talk to riders, when we do surveys with them, what they say, the main reason for them to work in this field, for them to work as riders, is indeed the flexibility that this job offers them. So now to come to the last part of my answer. So riders really are at the heart of the business in the end. So good working conditions for them are definitely a very, very important topic for us. And we also think that the Commission's proposal definitely has some very, very positive elements in there towards that goal. At the same time, however, we also, similar to Markus, have a number of concerns with the proposal, and especially the overall approach and direction this is taking right now, primarily with the rebuttable presumption of employment that Tommaso mentioned earlier. because we think, I mean, there's a very, very strong focus on that. But when we talk about really improving the working conditions of genuinely self-employed workers, we don't think that the rebuttable presumption of employment really solves this issue. And the way it is phrased right now, in our view, could even lead to the fact that workers are forced into an employment relationship. Genuinely self-employed people are forced into an employment relationship, at least temporarily. That is clearly not in the interest, as I just said. So, I mean, such a change would obviously have massive consequences for the workers themselves, but then also for the platforms, which have to change the system, engagement with the riders, to a much more rigid and much less efficient system. So, in our view, this particular element is definitely something that we should focus on in the next months.
This is also the element we will focus on in the next couple of minutes, because this is the next set of questions that I prepared to discuss. This is also the rebuttable presumption of an employment relationship is also the major pain point for most of our members. It is about the classification of persons working through platforms as workers as opposed to self-employed, where the digital label platforms controls the performance of the work. Now, yes, you have mentioned Mr. Alberini, 9 out of 10 platforms currently active in the EU are estimated to classify people working through them as self-employed. Many of them may see reclassification of their employment status due to the rebuttable presumption status. So I wonder, why did the Commission choose such a strong instrument to address the employment misclassification issues that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, indeed. I think the rebuttable presumption is somehow the heart of the Commission's proposal, in the sense that it is the instrument that we chose to tackle the main challenge that we saw in platform work when we started preparing this initiative. We started from the observation that many people working through platforms often experience poor working conditions. As I mentioned before, some people do not have access to the rights that workers have. So they don't have access to minimum wage protection, to occupational safety and health protection, and other legislation on employment protection. And for some of these, this is an unfair situation in the sense that they are being misclassified. So up to 5.5 million people might be misclassified, and therefore they are not enjoying the rights that they are entitled to. So starting with this observation, we started reflecting on which could be the legal instruments that could solve this situation. And so if you look, for instance, at our impact assessment that was published together with the proposal for a directive, you will see that we considered 3 main instruments. The first one was a kind of light touch guidance and interpretation support for authorities, so that they could understand better how to recognize misclassification and intervene when necessary. The second option was a shift in the burden of proof, and measures to improve legal certainty, for instance, certifications of an employment status issued by relevant authorities. However, we thought that these instruments were not going to be sufficient in a situation such as platform work, where the problem is one of very different labor market bargaining power. So in the labor market, in the platform economy, you have on the one hand the platforms who have very strong market power often, and on the other hand you have the people working through these platforms who are in many cases, for instance, from a migrant background, or they are students, they're low wage earners. So they're really people who often do not have the power, the influence, or even the legal knowledge or possibilities to challenge an unfair situation. So the rebuttable presumption comes in and facilitates their accessing to administrative and legal procedures that can lead to the reclassification of their employment status. So really it's an instrument that says we take stock of the fact that you might not be able to get your rights enforced, and we facilitate the procedure that you would have to go through in order to challenge your employment status misclassification. And it's important to stress that this rebuttable presumption is not a so-called universal rebuttable presumption, so it does not apply across the board to all platforms. We did consider doing this. That would have been a really strong instrument, but perhaps a disproportionate one, because we did see that many platforms in Europe are in fact mere intermediaries. So they simply they simply showcase labor demand and labor supply, and then the kind of matching is done freely between clients and people who offer services. So we didn't want to capture these platforms because this would have been a disproportionate burden for these companies. We only wanted to capture those platforms who exert control on the people working through them, and therefore have a relationship with the people working through them that is akin to that of employment subordination, i.e. these platforms act as employers, so they take over the control that they need to take on the people working through them, but they don't have the obligations that often come with being employers. So this is the reason why we chose to have this rebuttable presumption, to facilitate access to procedures for people who are often in a weak labor market position. But still, we put in place some safeguards to make sure that only those platforms who really exert control are captured, whereas the others are kind of off the hook, if you will. So they don't fall under the rebuttable presumption.
I see. Now, many self-employed persons who perform platform work wish to remain self-employed, even if they work through platforms that are not mere intermediaries. So I ask now, or both representatives of such platforms, how do you think the rebuttable presumption would affect your business and also your contractors that you work with? Maybe we start again with Markus Steinhauser.
I was going to let Lukas go first, but maybe for the next question then. I think the rebuttable presumption for us at this point and how it's defined at the moment, it's quite tricky to evaluate what kind of implications it really would have in practice. Generally, as far as I understand it at the moment, also for us, so there are different criteria defined in the proposal, and if two of those criteria apply, then someone can be considered as employed. And as far as I understand those criteria at the moment, that would actually mean that everyone in our community who participates in the project would automatically be considered employed, because those criteria are quite broad and from my perspective apply to many, if not all, platforms, or even work that also happens outside of platforms, like hiring a contractor to fix your something in your house, for example, because it includes things like controlling the work, in the sense that the work result and what that looks like, but also setting kind of the conditions for how that should be, and a couple of other points. And I think that's the core part that we should discuss also going further is, are those criteria really specific enough and broad enough to capture what Tommaso said, but not just apply to all kinds of workers? Because again, I think it's really important that people aren't misclassified. But how I see it at the moment, this would mean that this would apply to everyone working for us, for example. And a lot of those people are maybe earning, let's say, less than 100 euros per year because they only participate in a couple of jobs. But if they participate in there, then those criteria, for example, would apply. So we need a bit more, I think, clarity on really what does it mean. Another aspect I think that's important, and I'm always trying to fight for this, is that I think the whole conversation around platform work is driven predominantly by the the most popular types of platforms that are out there in the market. And there are a lot of kind of smaller platforms or niche business models that also fall within the scope of the directive, but can look very different. And for example, if we look at our workers and what we're doing, it's actually not a lot of people with migration backgrounds or only students or things like that. It's actually quite often people with a very high degree, high education, and with a high income already, because that's the type of people we need for the projects that we're doing. And so, yeah, I think it's important to keep that in mind in the conversation, because it's not only these very dominant business models that everyone also knows I'm missing the word right now, that everyone knows kind of from our daily lives, because we use it as a service maybe. And also one maybe final comment regarding the intermediaries versus the platforms that manage the work. I think that's also, I can see the reasoning behind that, and that makes sense. But I would also be afraid that if we only look at the platforms that manage the work and not the intermediaries, that it's possible for those platforms to switch their business models and kind of only create a self-service approach. That's how we would call it for clients, which actually removes also potentially some of the safeties that platforms create for the crowd workers. So I know a couple of platforms that we've been also working with that, for example, sometimes struggle with the prices that clients pay if there is no one in between to manage the kind of the reward system for the workers, because if there's a lot of pressure on the market, they might take on jobs for much less than, for example, the minimum wage. So these are some things that I think are important to keep in mind when we talk about what platforms are being tackled, who's actually should enjoy an employment status, because that's what it is, and who should remain a freelance worker or a solo employed person.
Indeed, the diversity of business models is difficult to capture by the criteria that are listed currently in the proposal. Mr. Pilgram, how would you like to assess the impact on your business model?
Yeah, I think overall we can definitely agree with many of the points that Markus just mentioned. The criteria are definitely a key issue. We also are concerned about the fact that ultimately, I mean, obviously we're a very different sector as a company itself, but we are also afraid that ultimately platforms in our sector would regress to what we call a marketplace model, where they're pure intermediaries, which then in practice means that couriers work for individual restaurants with absolutely no oversight, and then there would be no improved working conditions for these workers ultimately if this happens. So this is a key concern that we also share. Overall, I would like to say again that we do support the goal of this proposal. We're just concerned about the approach that has been taken by now, and we actually believe that even in the EU there are some good approaches that would solve a lot of the problems I think that we're discussing right now. And one of these examples is for instance, Greece, which has last year adopted new legislation that recognizes that platform work can be done by self-employed, but also by employed people, and then provides the self-employed workers in Greece with increased rights. So for instance, self-employed platform workers now have a collective bargaining right in Greece, which is for us a great step forward. Or the platform has certain health and safety obligations that they have to fulfill. So basically, for instance, we have to provide the same equipment to employed as well as to self-employed workers. So for us, this is a very good approach, recognize self-employed platform work, and then really aiming to improve the working conditions of these workers. And obviously the Commission has already published their draft guidelines on collective bargaining, which are definitely a good step in the right direction in this context. But to the question on what adjustments exactly could be made to the proposal, again, the criteria are a key concern that we have, because they're very broad and could very likely capture a lot of genuinely self-employed people. And I think Markus just gave the best example for this. And again, here, what we could envision is looking at Greece again. Greece has taken the approach to define what is a self-employed worker. For instance, a self-employed worker is somebody in Greece who can use subcontractors or substitutes, decide on their tasks so they can reject tasks, work for third parties, and also decide their working time. So interestingly, these criteria are very close to the ruling from the ECJ from a couple of years ago, the so-called Yodel case. And we believe taking these criteria, for instance, would provide much more legal certainty, as they would simply focus much more on bogus self-employment rather than potentially capturing a lot of genuinely self-employed people. A second point I would like to make is another key issue that we have, especially because it's connected to the criteria as well, or to the presumption overall, is the way of working of the rebuttal in the current text, especially the fact that it does not have a suspensive effect. So why is that a problem for us? Because as I said earlier, the criteria are very broad and could likely include many genuinely self-employed people, which would mean that they are then presumed to be employees with all the consequences that such a decision has in terms of taxation, social security contributions, work schedule, hours, etc. So that's a massive change for the workers, but also for platforms, as I said in the beginning, that now have to restructure their systems in a very burdensome process, basically. But then after, because the presumption is tested, as far as we understand at least, against the national definition of a self-employed and a worker, that could ultimately be reversed if the rebuttal is successful, quote unquote. Platforms will need to adjust their systems again. Authorities potentially have to pay back certain contributions, etc. So for us, that actually could create more legal uncertainty rather than legal certainty.
So maybe a way could be to strengthen the position of self-employed persons working through platforms in order to give them more access to social protection, or give them also the rights for in the field of algorithmic management, which of course in the remaining time I would also like to touch upon briefly. The algorithmic management is also a topic in the General Data Protection Regulation, but also in the ongoing procedure for an AI Act, which certainly will cover some of the aspects that also your proposal is now covering. I turn to our industry representatives first. Do you have any issues in terms of algorithmic management there that you would like to see changed in the proposal? And there is another aspect that I would like to touch upon, is a provision that obliges platforms to create a communication channel for the persons working through platforms in order to allow them to communicate with each other. Is there a difficulty with implementing that, or have you ever already discussed internally what solutions could be useful in this respect when you implement it in your business model?
Markus, should I go first? Okay. I mean, your question is divided, I think, into two parts on two separate issues, or I mean, very related but separate issues. And I think my answer also needs to be divided into two parts then. So first on the algorithmic management and transparency, we believe this is definitely a very important topic. So we definitely support the ideas in the proposal and the provisions overall. We think there are, from a technical point of view, a few open questions that need to be answered. But again, overall, this is something we support. We believe that is important for workers. And in that context, actually, one of the things that we were wondering, some of the provisions only apply to workers, so employed platform workers. And we actually believe they should also apply ideally to self-employed workers, because transparency of algorithms is obviously important to all platform workers. Then on the first part, and then the second part, the communication channels, there we have a slightly different position. Also there, we definitely understand the aim behind this provision. That is a challenge, I think, that the whole sector is facing right now. But I also must admit that we're kind of struggling to understand how exactly this could look like in practice. Because when you read the article, it does seem a little bit like platforms should establish some kind of messaging or networking service on the digital infrastructure, which simply poses certain challenges to us. Because first of all, we don't have such a product right now, or we don't have such a tool on our product right now, so that would need to be developed and maintained, which is obviously quite difficult. But then another key challenge that we see in that is the article also states, I believe, that platforms should have no access to the communication and should not be able to monitor the communication. And there, we're not really sure how we could, if we had to develop this, maintain this, how we could then comply with the existing regulation, for instance, in terms of illegal content and similar issues, if there's no access to the communication. So our question would be, where's the oversight there? In this context, just to wrap up, I think it is also important to know that our riders have in many cases already existing, for instance, Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups where they can exchange and where they do exchange. So we would hope that this, for instance, would be something that would be sufficient. Alternatively, if there needs to be some dedicated tool for this, we think, for instance, local authority could take the lead on this and could guarantee the oversight on this. But ultimately, there's a lot of unclarity, I think, from our perspective. So actually, it would be great if Tommaso could maybe elaborate a little bit on how the Commission has really envisioned this to look like, and what, for instance, because it also says similarly effective means instead of such a digital tool could also be sufficient. So it would be great to understand, and super interesting to understand what exactly could similarly effective means look like.
Would you like to react immediately? That would be, I think.
Yes, I can react. So I also would like to react to what was said before, very briefly, on the rebuttable presumption, because I think it's a very important aspect. I would just like to point out, first of all, that if people are reclassified as workers, this does not mean that the flexibility that they were awarded before is necessarily lost. In fact, we know of many people who are employed and who have very flexible work contracts. I can think of the retail and hospitality sectors, but also, for instance, people working in the cleaning and kind of household services industry. So there's no real trade-off between an employment relationship and flexibility. The second point that I would like to stress is that the criteria, the list of criteria that we include in the directive, so under Article 4.2, these criteria were not taken out of the blue, in the sense that we conducted a thorough analysis of over 150, I think, court and administrative cases related to platform work, and we saw that these criteria are those that have been consistently applied by courts across member states when deciding on reclassification decisions. So these criteria, they are broad, they are necessarily broad because the proposal has to be future-proof. Were they to be more specific, probably it would be very easy for companies to circumvent them by simply tweaking their business models, and in a few years with the speed, this better than me, at which we have technological developments nowadays, the proposal would be completely useless in a few years. So we really sought to make it as future-proof as possible. And in fact, the two Yodel criteria, I think Lukas, you were referring to the Court of Justice ruling on the Yodel case. Those two criteria are in fact included in the proposal. They are criteria D and E of the directive legal text. On algorithmic management, so first of all, the scope, the personal scope, indeed, this part of the directive applies to both workers and self-employed people, and this was done purposefully because we saw in our analysis that when it comes to the lack of transparency in the use of automated means in the platform economy, it is not only workers who suffer the consequences of this, but all people, in fact, who do platform work should have the right to know and to understand how the decisions affect them in many ways. Also for self-employed people, for instance, the pay levels and the kind of the build-up of their reputation online, how the rankings are organized. All these aspects are very important for self-employed people as well, and that's why we sought to extend this particular section of the directive to self-employed people as well. And you mentioned transparency. So the transparency section. Yes, the transparency section also applies to self-employed people. The only sections that do not apply are those that refer to occupational safety and health and information and consultation. This is for a legal basis reason. We simply cannot apply these provisions to people who are not classified as workers. On the communication channels, last but not least, this provision, Article 15 in the directive, was introduced to kind of make up for the lack of a physical workplace, where in the past people could get together and discuss their working conditions and unionize and kind of have a collective voice vis-a-vis the person employing them. This does not happen in platforms, not even in platforms which are active physically, like for instance Delivery Hero or platforms that have a physical aspect to their work. So there's no way for these people to get to know each other and to communicate and to organize collectively.
I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm very sorry. Many issues, so I wanted to react.
I understand there's still much to discuss, I suppose, for the ongoing legislative procedure. I have to close up in one word. What is the issue that you expect to be the most controversial in the legislative procedure?
Is this question for me, I suppose?
Yes, it's a question for you. Yes.
Well, the rebuttable presumption, obviously, is the issue that most people seem to be struggling with, especially stakeholders. So,
thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to stay in touch and stay in dialogue during the whole process. Thank you also for Markus Steinhauser and Lukas Pilgram for the interesting discussion.